3 weeks ago, I signed a document that sent shockwaves through NATO headquarters in Brussels. Within 4 hours of my signature drying on that paper, emergency calls were being made. The U.S. Secretary of State contacted the Saudi foreign minister. The French president called the Pakistani prime minister. British intelligence scrambled their African analysts for an emergency briefing. They panicked. Not because of what the deal said on the surface. That one paragraph, 163 words, has the potential to end NATO's ability to operate freely in 14 African nations, and they know it. My name is Ibrahim Traoré. I'm the president of Burkina Faso. And today, I'm going to tell you exactly what's in that clause, why it terrifies the most powerful military alliance in history, and why they'll do everything in their power to make sure this deal fails. Let's start with what they want you to think this is about. The headlines called it a defense cooperation agreement. The BBC said it was about regional security partnerships. CNN framed it as Burkina Faso strengthening ties with Middle Eastern powers. Le Monde warned about growing instability as African nation pivots away from Western allies. All of that is surface-level nonsense, deliberate misdirection. This deal isn't primarily about defense. It's about breaking the economic chains that have kept Africa subjugated for decades. It's about creating an alternative to the Western-controlled financial system that has exploited us since independence. It's about building infrastructure, trade routes, and economic partnerships that don't require permission from Washington, Paris, or Brussels. And that terrifies them. Because if this works, if Burkina Faso, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan successfully create an economic and security framework that bypasses Western control, every other African nation will ask themselves, why are we still playing by their rules? Let me tell you how this started. Because the Western media won't. 6 months ago, I received a call from the Saudi Crown Prince, not a diplomatic courtesy call, a real conversation. He said something that caught my attention. He said, President Traoré, we've been watching what you're doing in Burkina Faso, the way you've pushed back against French neo-colonialism, the way you've nationalized your gold reserves, the way you've refused to accept exploitative mining contracts. We respect that, and we want to help. I was skeptical. I've heard we want to help from enough world leaders to know it usually means we want to control you in a different way. So I asked him directly, what do you want in return? He laughed. Not the diplomatic laugh you do to deflect, a real laugh. And he said, you know what's interesting? You're the first African leader who's asked me that question without pretending we're just doing this out of generosity. I respect that. Here's the truth. We want a reliable partner in West Africa. Someone who isn't going to fold the moment Washington threatens sanctions. Someone who understands that the world order is changing and the old powers aren't going to remain dominant forever. Then he said something that surprised me. And we want to learn from you. I said, learn from us? You're one of the richest countries in the world. What could you possibly learn from Burkina Faso? He said, how to say no, how to stand up to Western pressure, how to build sovereignty when everyone tells you it's impossible. Saudi Arabia has money, but we're still trapped in American security guarantees. Pakistan has nuclear weapons, but they're still dependent on IMF loans. You have nothing compared to us in terms of resources, but you have something we don't. You've figured out how to resist. That conversation changed everything. Because I realized we weren't negotiating from weakness. We were negotiating from a position of moral authority, from a position of proven resistance. And that's worth something in a world where most leaders cave at the first sign of pressure. 3 months later, Pakistani officials reached out, same message, different context. They said, we've been watching your confrontation with France. We've been watching how you've handled the pressure from the IMF. We've dealt with similar pressures for decades. We think there's an opportunity for cooperation. And that's when the idea emerged. What if we created a trilateral framework? Burkina Faso, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, 3 countries from 3 different regions, 3 different economic profiles, 3 different levels of military capability, but all 3 committed to one principle: sovereignty is non-negotiable. We started negotiating in April, quietly, very quietly. We didn't announce it. We didn't leak it to the press. We kept it contained to a small circle of trusted advisors. Because we knew, the moment the West found out, they'd try to sabotage it. The negotiations took 4 months. We met in Jeddah, in Islamabad, in Ouagadougou. We brought legal teams, economic advisors, military strategists. We went through draft after draft, clause after clause, making sure every word was precise, every commitment was clear, every loophole was closed. And on August 15th, we signed. The agreement is 73 pages long. It covers defense cooperation, economic partnerships, technology transfer, intelligence sharing, infrastructure development, and cultural exchange. But the real substance, the reason NATO panicked, is in the annexes. Specifically, Annex D, titled Mutual Economic Security Framework. And within that annex, buried on page 47, is Clause 7. Let me read it to you. Word for word. Clause 7, Prohibited Third-Party Operations. Section 4, Military and Intelligence Oversight. Subsection B, the signatory nations agree that no foreign military or intelligence operations shall be conducted within their respective territories or territorial waters without explicit written consent from all three signatory governments. This includes, but is not limited to, overflights by military aircraft, naval transit through territorial waters, intelligence gathering operations, drone surveillance, satellite reconnaissance requiring ground-based infrastructure, training of proxy forces, establishment of military installations, deployment of private military contractors, or any other activities that could be construed as military or intelligence operations by non-signatory nations. Any violation of this clause by a third party shall be considered a violation against all three signatories and shall trigger the mutual defense provisions outlined in Clause 12. 163 words. Let me explain why this matters. Right now, the United States has military operations in at least 34 African countries. Officially, they call them security partnerships or counterterrorism cooperation or training missions. But what they really are is this: a network of bases, drone stations, and intelligence posts that give the U.S. military the ability to operate anywhere in Africa with minimal oversight. They don't ask permission, they inform, or sometimes they don't even inform. They just do it. And African governments dependent on U.S. aid, afraid of U.S. sanctions, aware of what happens to leaders who resist, they accept it. France does the same thing. They have military bases in Djibouti, Chad, Senegal, Gabon, Ivory Coast. They conduct operations throughout the Sahel. They claim it's about fighting terrorism. But really, it's about maintaining control over their former colonies. And the system works because African nations are isolated. When the U.S. threatens Burkina Faso stands alone. When France pressures Mali, Mali has to decide, submit or suffer. There's no collective response, no mutual defense, no unified position. Clause 7 changes that. Because now, if the United States wants to conduct drone operations over Burkina Faso, even just flying through our airspace, they need written consent from Burkina Faso, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, all three. If France wants to stage a military operation from a base in West Africa, they need approval from all three signatories. And here's the critical part. Any violation of this clause by a third party shall be considered a violation against all three signatories. That means if the U.S. conducts an unauthorized operation in Burkina Faso, it's not just a violation of Burkina Faso's sovereignty. It's a violation against Saudi Arabia and Pakistan too. And that triggers mutual defense obligations. Now, am I saying we're going to war with the United States if they fly a drone over our territory without permission? No. That would be insane. We're not suicidal. But what I am saying is this: the cost of violating our sovereignty just went up exponentially. Because now the U.S. has to consider, is this drone flight worth damaging relations with Saudi Arabia, one of our key Middle Eastern allies, a major oil producer, and a massive purchaser of American weapons? Is it worth damaging relations with Pakistan, a nuclear power, a key player in South Asia, and a country we need for any regional stability in Afghanistan? That's the leverage. That's the deterrent. Before this deal, the calculation was simple: violate Burkina Faso's sovereignty. Burkina Faso complains. We ignore them. What are they going to do? They're poor. They're militarily weak. They're dependent on aid. So we do whatever we want. But now the calculation is different. Violate Burkina Faso's sovereignty. Saudi Arabia and Pakistan have to respond. Diplomatically at minimum. Economically if necessary. And suddenly, The cost-benefit analysis doesn't work anymore. That's what NATO is panicking about. Let me tell you what happened in the 72 hours after we signed. Within 4 hours, the U.S. State Department issued a statement, carefully worded, diplomatic. But the message was clear. The United States is concerned about recent defense agreements that may complicate regional security cooperation. We urge all parties to ensure that any partnerships align with international norms and do not undermine existing frameworks. Translation: you just screwed up our ability to do whatever we want in West Africa and we're not happy about it. 6 hours after that, the French Foreign Ministry released a statement. France notes with concern the growing militarization of security partnerships in the Sahel region. We call on all nations to prioritize transparency and avoid agreements that could destabilize existing peace and security operations. Translation: we've had free reign in West Africa for decades, and you just made our lives much more complicated. 12 hours later, NATO convened an emergency session of their Africa Working Group. I know this because we have sources, good sources. People who are tired of watching Western powers dictate Africa's future. According to our sources, the meeting lasted 4 hours. They discussed the strategic implications of the Saudi-Pakistan-Burkina Faso agreement. They war-gamed scenarios. They discussed countermeasures. And the consensus, apparently, was panic. Because they realized what we'd done. We'd created a tripwire, a mechanism that makes their standard operating procedure act first, ask questions later, much more costly. 24 hours after signing, I received a call from the U.S. ambassador to Burkina Faso. Very polite, very diplomatic. He asked for an urgent meeting to discuss recent developments. I agreed. He came to my office the next morning. He said, "Mr. President, we've reviewed the agreement you signed with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. We have some concerns." I said, "I'm sure you do." He continued, "Specifically, Clause 7, the provisions around third-party military operations. We're concerned this could complicate our counter-terrorism operations in the region." I said, "Your counter-terrorism operations or your unauthorized military operations?" He paused, chose his words carefully. "Mr. President, we've had a productive partnership with Burkina Faso on security matters. We've provided training, equipment, intelligence. This clause could jeopardize that cooperation." I said, "Let me be clear. We're not opposed to cooperation. We're opposed to being treated like we don't have sovereignty. If the United States wants to conduct operations in Burkina Faso, all you have to do is ask, formally, in writing, follow proper channels, treat us like the sovereign nation we are. That's all we're asking." He said, "Mr. President, military operations often require speed, flexibility. Sometimes we can't wait for diplomatic approvals. There are terrorists who..." I cut him off. There are always terrorists. There's always an emergency. There's always a reason why you can't follow proper procedure. But somehow when it's your territory, you have all the procedures in the world. When it's our territory, suddenly procedures are too slow, too bureaucratic. I'm not buying it anymore. He didn't like that. His tone changed, got colder, more formal. He said, "Mr. President, I would urge you to consider the broader implications of this agreement. The United States has been a generous partner to Burkina Faso. We've provided significant aid, development assistance, security cooperation. Decisions that complicate our relationship could have consequences." There it is. The threat. Dressed up in diplomatic language, but a threat nonetheless. I said, "Are you threatening to cut aid because we signed an agreement that requires you to respect our sovereignty?" He said, "I'm not threatening anything. I'm simply noting that partnerships are built on mutual trust and cooperation. When one party makes decisions that undermine that trust, it affects the partnership." I said, "Let me tell you what undermines trust. Flying drones over our territory without telling us, conducting military operations without our approval, training proxy forces that sometimes turn against us. Treating our country like your playground, that undermines trust. This agreement, this is us setting boundaries. And if you can't respect boundaries, then maybe the problem isn't the agreement. Maybe the problem is you." He left shortly after that. And 2 days later, the U.S. announced a routine review of aid programs to Burkina Faso, which is code for, "We're going to punish you for this." But here's what they don't understand. We expected this. We planned for it. That's why the agreement isn't just about military operations. it's about economic partnerships. Because we knew the West would try to use aid as leverage, so we built alternatives. Saudi Arabia committed to $300 million in infrastructure investments, roads, schools, hospitals, no conditions, no political strings. Just, here's the money, build what you need. Pakistan committed to technology transfer in agriculture and manufacturing. They're sending experts to help us improve crop yields, establish processing facilities, build industrial capacity. And both countries committed to long-term trade partnerships. Saudi Arabia will buy our agricultural products. Pakistan will import our cotton. We'll export to them, they'll export to us, and we'll reduce our dependence on Western markets. That's the framework. That's how we survive the pressure. But let me get back to Clause 7, because there's more to it than just the military operations provision. The clause also includes language about intelligence gathering operations. That's the part that really scares them. Because right now, Western intelligence agencies operate throughout Africa with impunity. The CIA has informants, surveillance operations, signals intelligence posts. French intelligence does the same. British intelligence, German intelligence. They collect data, track movements, monitor communications. And most of the time, African governments either don't know about it or can't stop it. But Clause 7 makes those operations illegal without explicit consent, and if they violate it, it triggers diplomatic consequences with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. Saudi Arabia has significant influence in global oil markets. Pakistan has nuclear weapons and a strategic location between South Asia and the Middle East. Both countries have leverage that Burkina Faso alone doesn't have. So when Western intelligence agencies have to calculate the risk of unauthorized operations, they now have to consider, is this intelligence worth damaging relationships with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan? That changes the math. Let me tell you about a specific example. Because this isn't theoretical. It's already having effects. 2 weeks after we signed the agreement, our intelligence services detected an unusual signal pattern. Foreign drones conducting surveillance over our northern border region. Based on the flight patterns and the technology signatures, we believe they were American drones. Under the old system, we would have filed a diplomatic protest. The U.S. would have either denied it or said it was part of regional counterterrorism operations. We would have complained. They would have ignored us. End of story. But under the new agreement, we had options. We documented the flights, we collected evidence, and we filed a formal complaint not just with the United States, but also with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. Under Clause 7, this was a violation of the agreement, and both signatory nations had to respond. Saudi Arabia summoned the U.S. ambassador to Riyadh. They didn't make it public, but they made it clear. This is a violation of an agreement we're party to. It affects our relationship. Pakistan did the same, called in the U.S. diplomatic staff, expressed serious concern about unauthorized operations that violate agreements Pakistan has signed. And you know what happened? The drone flights stopped, immediately. Not because the U.S. suddenly developed respect for our sovereignty, but because the cost of continuing those flights' damage to relationships with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan was higher than the intelligence value. That's how deterrence works. That's how collective security works. And that's why NATO is panicking. Because if this model spreads, if other African countries sign similar agreements with other non-Western powers, NATO's entire operational framework in Africa collapses. Imagine if Mali signs an agreement with Iran and Turkey, with similar provisions. Now unauthorized French military operations trigger diplomatic crises with Iran and Turkey. Imagine if Niger signs an agreement with China and Russia, now unauthorized U.S. Drone flights trigger responses from Beijing and Moscow. Imagine if 10, 15, 20 African countries all have agreements like this, with different partners, different configurations, but all with the same core principle. You cannot operate on our territory without permission, and if you violate that, you're not just violating us, you're violating our partners too. That's the nightmare scenario for NATO. That's what keeps them up at night. Because their entire African strategy is built on the assumption that African nations are weak, isolated, and can be pressured individually. But if African nations start building collective security frameworks with powerful non-Western partners, that assumption breaks down. Now let me address the obvious question. What about Clause 12, the mutual defense provision I mentioned earlier? This is the part that really makes Western military planners nervous. Clause 12 states, in the event that any signatory nation faces military aggression or sustained economic coercion from a third party, the other signatory nations commit to providing appropriate diplomatic, economic, and if necessary, military support to defend the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the affected nation. It's carefully worded, appropriate support, if necessary. It's not an automatic declaration of war. It's not NATO's Article 5. But it's a commitment, a serious one. And it means that if someone decides to invade Burkina Faso or impose crippling sanctions or orchestrate a coup, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan have committed to respond. Now, would Saudi Arabia send troops to defend Burkina Faso? Probably not. Would Pakistan deploy military forces to West Africa? Unlikely. But that's not the point. The point is deterrence. The point is raising the cost. Because now anyone planning military action or regime change in Burkina Faso has to consider, what will Saudi Arabia do? What will Pakistan do? Will they impose economic consequences? Will they cut diplomatic ties? Will they retaliate in other regions where they have leverage? Those are questions that didn't exist before. Those are complications that make regime change more difficult, more costly, more risky. And in international relations, often the threat of consequences is enough to prevent action. Let me tell you about a conversation I had with a Western military analyst, off the record, someone who used to work in defense planning. He said, "President Traoré, you've made things very complicated for us." I said, "Good, that's the point." He said, "You understand this doesn't make you safer, right? It just means when they come for you, and they will come for you, it'll be harder, more expensive, but they'll still come." I said, "Maybe, but here's what you're not considering. Every month that this agreement holds, every month that the framework proves it works, other countries will join. Other partnerships will form, and at some point the cost becomes too high. At some point it's not worth it anymore. That's what we're betting on." He didn't have a response to that. Because he knew I was right. He knew that this agreement isn't just about Burkina Faso. It's about creating a model, a template, a proof of concept. And if it works, if we can show that small countries can build collective security frameworks with non-Western powers and actually enhance their sovereignty, it changes everything. Now let me talk about the economic provisions, because this is where the agreement gets really interesting. Clause 7's prohibition on unauthorized military operations is the headline grabber. It's what NATO panicked about. But the economic provisions in the other clauses are what will sustain this agreement long term. The agreement establishes a trilateral investment fund, $500 million, divided equally among the three nations. The fund will be used to finance infrastructure projects, technology transfer, and trade facilitation. But here's the key. The fund operates outside the Western financial system. No World Bank approval required, no IMF conditions, no dollar-denominated transactions unless we choose to use dollars. We're using a basket of currencies, Saudi riyals, Pakistani rupees, and our own CFA francs, though we're working on transitioning away from the CFA entirely. The fund can also settle transactions in yuan if needed, since China is a major trade partner for all three countries. This is huge, because it means we're building economic infrastructure that doesn't depend on Western institutions, that can't be sanctioned by the US Treasury, that can't be frozen if we make decisions Washington doesn't like. The agreement also includes technology transfer provisions. Saudi Arabia is sharing expertise in solar energy, something they've heavily invested in as they try to diversify away from oil. Pakistan is sharing agricultural technology and textile manufacturing knowledge. And we're sharing something valuable too, our experience in resistance, our knowledge of how to maintain sovereignty under pressure, our understanding of how to build systems that can survive economic warfare. That might sound strange. What could we possibly teach Saudi Arabia and Pakistan? They're much more developed, much wealthier, much more powerful militarily. But here's what they don't have. Recent experience standing up to Western pressure and surviving. Saudi Arabia is still dependent on US security guarantees. Despite their tensions over issues like the Yemen war and the Khashoggi killing, Pakistan is still trapped in cycles of IMF loans and conditions. We've survived sanctions, we've survived aid cuts, we've survived isolation. We've figured out how to keep our country functioning when the West tries to strangle us economically. That's valuable knowledge, and both countries want to learn from it. because they both see a future where they might need to make hard choices that anger Washington, and they want to know, can we survive that? What does it take? We're teaching them, and in exchange, they're helping us build economic alternatives that make survival easier. That's the partnership. That's the real substance of this agreement. Now let me address the criticism, because I know what they're saying. I've heard it all. They say, Traoré is aligning with authoritarian regimes. Saudi Arabia has a terrible human rights record. Pakistan has been accused of supporting militant groups. Why would you partner with them? Let me be very clear about something. I'm not naive. I know Saudi Arabia isn't a democracy. I know there are serious questions about human rights in Pakistan. I don't agree with everything these governments do. But here's what I also know. The West has no moral authority to lecture me about who I partner with. France, which now lectures us about human rights, maintained colonial rule in Africa through violence and exploitation for a century. The United States, which talks about democracy, has overthrown democratically elected governments all over the world when those governments didn't serve American interests. The West has partnered with dictators, supported coups, funded death squads, and invaded sovereign nations based on lies, and they did all of this while claiming to represent human rights and democracy. So forgive me if I don't take their criticism seriously. I'm not choosing partners based on who the West approves of. I'm choosing partners based on who treats us with respect, who offers genuine partnership, who doesn't attach political conditions to economic cooperation. Saudi Arabia isn't trying to control our foreign policy. Pakistan isn't demanding that we adopt their political system. They're offering resources, technology, and partnership. And in exchange, they want a reliable partner in West Africa who won't collapse the moment Washington applies pressure. That's a trade I'm willing to make. Because at the end of the day, my responsibility is to the people of Burkina Faso, not to satisfy Western moral sensibilities, not to align with countries that the U.S. approves of, but to build partnerships that serve our interests, that enhance our sovereignty, that give us options. And this agreement does that. Let me tell you about one more aspect of this agreement that hasn't gotten much attention but is critically important. The intelligence sharing provisions. Clause 9 establishes a joint intelligence coordination center. Representatives from all three countries will staff it. The center will share information about security threats, economic intelligence, and political developments that affect mutual interests. This is revolutionary for us because right now most of our intelligence comes from Western sources, France, the United States, other European countries, and that intelligence always comes with strings, always comes with bias, always serves their interests first. Sometimes they share intelligence that's designed to manipulate us, to make us see threats where they want us to see threats, to ignore threats that don't serve their agenda. But now we have alternative sources. Saudi intelligence has extensive networks throughout the Middle East and the Muslim world. Pakistani intelligence has deep relationships throughout South Asia and parts of Central Asia. And we have on-the-ground knowledge of West Africa that they don't have. When we share intelligence, we're not subordinates receiving information from a superior. We're partners sharing information as equals. That changes the dynamic completely. For example, last week, our Intelligence Coordination Center flagged unusual financial transactions flowing through shell companies registered in Europe but operating in West Africa. Money that appeared to be funding opposition groups in multiple Sahel countries simultaneously. When we traced the money, we found connections to organizations linked to Western intelligence services. Not definitive proof, but enough circumstantial evidence to raise serious questions. We shared this intelligence with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. They had additional information from their own sources. And together, we built a more complete picture of what's happening. A coordinated destabilization campaign targeting governments in the Sahel that have resisted Western control. Without this intelligence-sharing framework, we never would have seen the full picture. We would have seen isolated incidents and assumed they were unrelated. But with intelligence from multiple sources, the pattern becomes clear. That's the power of collective intelligence. That's what this agreement enables. And that terrifies Western intelligence agencies, because their entire approach relies on information asymmetry. They know things we don't know. They see patterns we can't see. They use that knowledge advantage to manipulate and control. But when we build our own intelligence networks, when we share information with partners who aren't subordinate to Western intelligence, that advantage disappears. Now let me talk about what happened at the African Union after we signed this agreement. The response was mixed. Some countries publicly supported us. Others stayed quiet. A few criticized us, usually countries that are heavily dependent on Western aid and couldn't afford to anger their donors. But privately, the response was overwhelmingly positive. I've received calls from at least 11 African heads of state, all saying the same thing. We support what you're doing. We wish we could do the same, but we can't. Not yet. 3 countries asked us directly, can we join this framework? Can we become signatories? And that's when I realized this isn't just an agreement between 3 countries. This is the beginning of a new security architecture. We're currently in discussions with Mali and Niger about observer status. The idea is that they would participate in certain aspects of the agreement, particularly the economic and intelligence sharing provisions, without full membership. And if things work out, they could become full signatories. We're also in preliminary discussions with countries outside Africa. Indonesia has expressed interest. Iran has made inquiries. Even some countries in Latin America have reached out to learn more about the framework. Because what we've created isn't specific to Africa. It's a model for how small and medium-sized countries can build collective security frameworks that enhance sovereignty without depending on Western institutions. That's scalable. That's replicable. And that's dangerous to the current world order. Let me tell you what I think happens next, because I'm not naive. I know the West won't accept this quietly. First, they'll try to undermine the agreement diplomatically. They'll pressure Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. They'll offer incentives for them to abandon the agreement or water it down. They'll create situations where the Saudis and Pakistanis have to choose between maintaining the agreement and other interests they have with the West. Second, they'll try to create divisions between the signatories. They'll exploit any differences. They'll amplify any tensions. They'll try to make us fight among ourselves so the agreement falls apart from internal contradictions. Third, they'll try to prove the agreement doesn't work. They'll test it, maybe with unauthorized operations to see if we actually respond. Maybe with economic pressure to see if Saudi Arabia and Pakistan really defend us. They'll probe for weaknesses. And fourth, if all of that fails, they'll try to remove me. Coup. Assassination. Some kind of regime change operation that installs a more compliant government in Burkina Faso. I know all of this is coming. I'm prepared for it. But here's what they're not prepared for. We anticipated their moves. We've built redundancies into the agreement. We've created mechanisms that survive even if I'm removed from power. The agreement isn't personal. It's institutional. It's locked into place by legal frameworks, economic interests, and mutual dependencies that transcend any individual leader. If they remove me tomorrow, the agreement continues. The framework persists. The model remains. Because this was never about me. This was always about creating a template for sovereignty that survives individual leaders. Let me close with this. I know some of you are thinking, Traoré, this sounds too good to be true. How do you know Saudi Arabia and Pakistan won't betray you? How do you know they won't cave to Western pressure? I don't know, not with certainty. That's the honest answer. This agreement is a bet, a calculated risk. We're betting that Saudi Arabia and Pakistan's interests in maintaining diverse partnerships, in hedging against total Western dependence, are strong enough that they'll defend this framework even when pressured. We're betting that the economic benefits, access to African markets, partnership with countries that are willing to resist Western pressure are valuable enough to sustain the agreement. We're betting that the strategic value having reliable partners in regions where they've historically had limited influence outweighs the costs of angering Washington. Are we certain? No. But we're certain of this. The status quo, complete dependence on the West, total vulnerability to Western pressure, perpetual subordination that's unacceptable. So we're trying something different. We're building alternatives. We're creating options. And if it works, if this agreement holds, if the framework proves effective, if other countries join, we'll have fundamentally altered the power dynamics that have governed Africa for decades. That's worth the risk. That's worth the pressure. That's worth the inevitable retaliation. Because some things are worth fighting for. Sovereignty is one of them. Dignity is another. And the right to build partnerships on our own terms, not as subordinates, but as equals, that's non-negotiable. Clause 7 is 163 words. But those words represent something much bigger. They represent a refusal to accept the world as it is. They represent a determination to build the world as it should be, They represent the idea that small countries don't have to remain powerless, that collective action can level the playing field, that sovereignty is possible even for countries that the West has written off as weak and irrelevant. NATO panicked because they saw what this represents, not just one agreement, but the beginning of a movement. The first crack in a system that has dominated global politics since the end of World War II. They're right to panic, because this is the beginning, not the end. My name is Ibrahim Traoré. I'm the president of Burkina Faso, and I just signed an agreement that terrifies the most powerful military alliance in history. Not because of what we're doing today, but because of what this enables tomorrow. But let me tell you something else they don't want you to know. Something that makes this agreement even more dangerous to their interests. Something buried in Clause 15 that we haven't discussed yet. Clause 15 deals with what we call economic counter-coercion mechanisms. Fancy language for a simple concept. If the West tries to economically strangle any of us, the other two countries have committed to filling the gap. Let me explain how this works in practice. Right now, the United States announced that routine review of aid to Burkina Faso, which means they're probably going to cut some or all of it. That's their standard playbook. You defy us, we cut your money, you come crawling back. But here's what they didn't account for. The moment they announced that review, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan activated Clause 15. Within 72 hours, both countries had notified us that they would compensate for any shortfall in American aid, dollar for dollar. So if the U.S. cuts $100 million in aid, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan split the difference, $50 million each, and they deposit it directly into our treasury. No World Bank intermediary, no IMF conditions, just straight compensation. You see what this does? It makes economic coercion worthless. The West's primary tool for controlling African governments, the threat of cutting aid, becomes useless when other countries have committed to making up the difference. And it gets better. Clause 15 doesn't just cover aid cuts. It covers sanctions, trade restrictions, financial blacklisting, any form of economic pressure. If the U.S. Treasury tries to freeze Burkina Faso's assets in American banks, Saudi Arabia has committed to providing equivalent credit lines. If European countries impose trade sanctions, Pakistan has committed to opening their markets to compensate for the lost trade. This is a complete economic safety net. And it's revolutionary. Because for the first time, an African country can resist Western pressure without facing economic collapse. We have alternatives. We have backup. We have partners who've committed in writing, with legal obligations to keep our economy afloat even when the West tries to destroy it. That changes everything. Let me tell you about a meeting I had last week with the World Bank's Regional Director for Africa. He came to Ouagadougou on what he called a routine consultation visit. But we both knew what it really was, an intimidation attempt. He sat in my office with his briefcase full of projections and charts, and he said very carefully, very diplomatically, "Mr. President, we're concerned about Burkina Faso's recent policy directions. The World Bank has always been a partner to your country. We've funded infrastructure projects, supported poverty reduction programs, provided technical assistance. But our board is becoming concerned that recent decisions, particularly certain international agreements, may indicate a shift away from market-oriented reforms and good governance practices." Good governance, that's their code word for doing what we tell you. I let him finish his presentation, all the graphs showing how much money the World Bank has given us over the years. All the warnings about how our credit rating might be affected if we continue on this trajectory. All the subtle threats about future funding. Then I said, "Let me ask you something. In the past 10 years, how much has the World Bank lent to Burkina Faso?" He checked his notes. "Approximately $800 million. I said, "And how much have we paid back in debt service?" He hesitated. "I don't have those exact figures with me." I said, "I do. We've paid back $620 million in 10 years. That's interest payments alone." The principal barely moved. "So we borrowed $800 million, paid back $620 million, and we still owe $740 million. Does that math work for you?" He started to respond, but I cut him off. "And here's the other thing. That $800 million you loaned us, it came with conditions. We had to privatize our water system. We had to open our telecommunications sector to foreign investment. We had to cut public sector wages. We had to eliminate subsidies for farmers, all in the name of market-oriented reforms. And you know what happened? Our water got more expensive and less reliable. Our telecom profits flowed out of the country. Our teachers left for better-paying jobs in neighboring countries. Our farmers couldn't compete with subsidized European imports. He said, "Mr. President, those reforms were designed to improve efficiency and attract investment." I said, "They were designed to open our economy for exploitation, and they worked exactly as intended. For you, not for us." Then I leaned forward. "So here's what's going to happen. Saudi Arabia and Pakistan have committed to providing development financing, $500 million. No conditions about privatization, no requirements to cut social spending, no demands that we open our markets to their corporations. Just, here's the money, build what you need, grow your economy. And when you're profitable enough, pay us back, fair interest, fair terms." I watched his face. He was calculating, realizing what this meant. I continued, "So when you go back to your board, you tell them this: Burkina Faso doesn't need the World Bank anymore. We have alternatives. And those alternatives treat us like partners, not like children who need to be disciplined into accepting your economic model." He left 20 minutes later. And 3 days after that, the World Bank announced a pause in new lending to Burkina Faso, pending a governance review. Exactly as we predicted. Exactly as we prepared for. And exactly as Clause 15 was designed to handle. Because the moment that announcement came, Saudi Arabia transferred $150 million to our Infrastructure Development Fund. Pakistan followed with $50 million for agricultural modernization. And suddenly the World Bank's pause didn't matter. That's the power of this agreement. That's why they're terrified. Let me tell you about another conversation I had with a European CEO whose company has mining operations in Burkina Faso. He requested a meeting, said it was urgent. He came to my office looking worried, and he said, "Mr. President, we've heard rumors that your new agreement with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan might affect foreign investment climate. Our shareholders are concerned. They're wondering if their investments are secure." I said, "Your investments are secure as long as you follow our laws and pay fair taxes. Has something changed?" He said, "Well, no. But there are concerns that increased alignment with non-Western partners might lead to policy unpredictability." I said, "Policy unpredictability. That's an interesting phrase. Let me tell you what's actually unpredictable. Your company has been mining gold in Burkina Faso for 12 years. In those 12 years, you've extracted approximately $2 billion worth of gold. You know how much tax you've paid to Burkina Faso? $300 million. That's 15%. 15% of the value you extracted from our soil." He started to speak, but I wasn't done. "And you know why it's only 15%? Because your accountants are very creative. You have subsidiaries in Luxembourg and the Cayman Islands. You sell the gold to those subsidiaries at artificially low prices. Then those subsidiaries sell it on the international market at real prices, and the massive profit gets taxed in Luxembourg at 2%, or in the Cayman Islands at 0%, not here, not in the country where the gold actually came from." He said, "Mr. President, those are standard international business practices. Every company does this." I said, "Standard practices for theft, maybe. But we're changing the rules. New mining contracts will require 70% of refining to happen in Burkina Faso. They'll require transparent pricing that reflects actual market rates, and they'll require an effective tax rate of at least 35%, no offshore subsidiaries, no transfer pricing schemes. Transparent, fair taxation." His face went pale. "Mr. President, those terms they're not competitive with other African countries. Our shareholders will want to divest." I said, "Then divest. Saudi Arabia has expressed interest in co-investing in mining operations under our new terms. Pakistan wants to help us build refining capacity. If your shareholders would rather abandon a profitable operation because they can't extract obscene profits anymore, that's their choice. But they're not going to bully us into accepting exploitation just because every company does this." He left. And 2 weeks later, his company announced they were reviewing their investment strategy in West Africa, which is corporate speak for, "We're trying to figure out if we can still make enough money under these new rules, or if we should cut our losses." I don't know what they'll decide, and honestly, I don't care. Because that's what sovereignty means. It means we set the terms, we decide what's fair, and if foreign companies don't like it, they can leave. We'll find others. Or we'll do it ourselves. That's the mentality shift this agreement enables. We're not desperate anymore. We're not begging for investment. We have partners who will invest on fair terms, which means we can demand fairness from everyone else too. Let me tell you what happened with France, because this is important. 3 weeks after we signed the agreement, I received a phone call from the French president, not through diplomatic channels, direct call. He said he wanted to discuss the future of Franco-Burkinabe relations. I took the call, and he started with the usual pleasantries. How much France values our partnership, how concerned they are about regional security, how they want to ensure continued cooperation. Then he got to the point. He said, "President Traoré, we've noticed your recent defense agreement with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. France has been a security partner to Burkina Faso for many years. We're concerned this new agreement might complicate our ability to respond quickly to terrorism threats in the Sahel." I said, "Complicate how? If there's a genuine terrorism threat and France wants to help, all you need to do is request permission through proper channels. We'll evaluate the request and respond." He said, "But President Traoré, terrorism doesn't wait for bureaucratic processes. Sometimes we need to act immediately. The requirement to get approval from 3 different governments could cost lives." I said, "You know what costs lives? When French forces conduct operations without coordinating with us and civilians die because you didn't know they were civilians. When you bomb a wedding because your intelligence said it was a terrorist meeting. When you conduct raids in villages without telling us and people get killed in the crossfire, that costs lives. So forgive me if I don't accept bureaucratic processes as an excuse to bypass our sovereignty." There was a long pause. Then his tone changed, got harder. He said, "President Traoré, let me be frank. France has been patient with Burkina Faso's evolution. We've tolerated the rhetoric, the criticism, the expulsion of our diplomats. But this agreement crosses a line. It threatens French strategic interests in the region, and France will not stand by while our interests are undermined. There it is. The real France. Not the France of liberty, equality, fraternity. The France of colonial control. The France that sees Africa as their backyard." I said, "Let me be frank too, President. France has been in the Sahel for 60 years. 60 years of French troops, French bases, French operations. And you know what we have to show for it? More terrorism, more instability, more violence. Either you're incompetent at fighting terrorism, or you're not really here to fight terrorism. Either way, we don't need you anymore." He said, "You're making a mistake. Saudi Arabia and Pakistan don't understand Africa. They don't have experience operating here. You're trading a proven partner for unknown entities." I said, "A proven partner? France has military bases in Chad, Mali, Niger, Senegal. You have 5,000 troops deployed across the Sahel, and somehow terrorism keeps getting worse. Either you're failing at your stated mission, or the mission isn't really what you claim it is. Either way, I'm not interested in continuing this partnership." He didn't like that. The call ended shortly after, very cold goodbye. And the next week, France announced it was reassessing its military presence in West Africa, which is diplomatic code for, "We're going to punish you for this." But here's what happened next. Saudi Arabia offered to help fund our own military modernization. Pakistan offered to train our special forces. Turkey, which has been watching this whole situation closely, reached out offering to sell us drones and armored vehicles on favorable terms. So France's reassessment doesn't scare us, because we have alternatives, real alternatives, not just promises, actual commitments, backed by contracts and money. That's what makes this agreement so powerful. It's not just a piece of paper. It's a functioning alternative to Western control. And it's working. Now let me talk about something that's been bothering me. The African leaders who criticize this agreement. There's a president, I won't name him, who gave an interview to a French newspaper. He said, "President Traoré is being reckless. He's gambling with Burkina Faso's stability. African countries need Western partnership. We can't afford to antagonize our traditional allies." Traditional allies. That phrase makes me sick. These traditional allies colonized us. They extracted our resources for a century. They drew our borders to divide us. They installed puppet governments when we tried to be independent. They assassinated our leaders when we resisted. Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, so many others. These are our traditional allies? No, these are our traditional oppressors, and the fact that some African leaders still call them allies shows how deeply the colonization runs. It's not just political, it's psychological. This president who criticized me, his country receives 70% of its budget from foreign aid. 70%. He literally cannot make any major decision without asking permission from donor countries. His entire government exists at their pleasure. And he has the audacity to call me reckless? I'd rather be reckless and sovereign than safe and subservient. Let me tell you about a young person I met last month, a university student. She came to one of my public addresses and asked a question that stayed with me. She said, "Mr. President, I support what you're doing, but I'm scared. My cousin works for an NGO that receives funding from USAID. My uncle works for a company that has contracts with European firms. My aunt is a teacher whose salary is partly funded by World Bank education programs. If the West cuts all this funding because of your policies, these people will suffer. How do you justify that?" It's a fair question. Actually, I said, "You're right to be scared. Change is scary. And yes, there will be disruption. Some people will lose jobs. Some programs will face funding gaps. Some things will get worse before they get better. I'm not going to lie to you about that." I saw her face. She was hoping I'd tell her everything would be fine, that there's a painless way to do this. I continued, "But let me ask you something. Your cousin's NGO, what does it do?" She said, "They work on women's empowerment." I said, "Good, important work, but I have a question. Why does an NGO need to do that work? Why isn't our government doing it? Why do we need foreigners to come here and empower our women? Do you think it's because we don't care about women's empowerment? Or is it because our government doesn't have money because 70% of our resource wealth gets extracted by foreign companies who pay minimal taxes?" She didn't have an answer. I said, "Your uncle's company, it has contracts with European firms. Good, but what does that company actually do? Does it manufacture things, design things? Or does it just provide cheap labor for European companies that design and manufacture elsewhere, keeping the high-value work for themselves?" She said quietly, "They mostly provide labor." I said, "Right, so your uncle has a job, but it's a job that keeps him dependent on European companies, a job that will never allow him to build his own company, to compete, to innovate, because the system is designed to keep him in that position." I looked at her, really looked at her. Here's the truth. Yes, some people will suffer in the short term. Your cousin might lose her NGO job. Your uncle's company might lose contracts. Your aunt's salary might be delayed if the World Bank freezes education funding. That's real. That's painful. And I don't minimize it. But the alternative is permanent dependency, permanent poverty, permanent subordination. Your generation and your children's generation and their children's generation, all living in a system designed to keep you poor and keep you dependent. That's the alternative. So yes, I'm asking your generation to sacrifice, to endure short-term pain for long-term sovereignty, and I know that's a hard ask, but I can't accept the alternative. I can't accept permanent colonization just because breaking free is difficult. She nodded. Slowly. And then she said something I'll never forget. She said, "My grandfather fought in the independence struggle. He told me stories about it, how hard it was, how many people died, how everyone said they were crazy to think they could defeat France. But they did it. And he always said his generation's greatest failure was that they won political independence but accepted economic dependence. He said we became free in name only." She paused. "So I guess what I'm saying is, I'm scared. But I understand. And I'll deal with the fear. Because someone has to finish what my grandfather started." That conversation reminded me why I'm doing this. Because there's a whole generation of young Africans who are tired of dependence, who are tired of being told they need Western saviors, who are ready to finish the liberation struggle their grandparents started. And this agreement, this Saudi, Pakistan, Burkina Faso framework, it's for them. It's building the infrastructure of sovereignty that they'll inherit. Let me address one more thing, because I know people are asking, what about China? Why isn't China part of this agreement? Good question, and the answer is complicated. China was actually one of the first countries we talked to when we started exploring alternative partnerships. We have good relations with China. They've invested in infrastructure here. They don't attach political conditions the way the West does. But here's the thing, China is already too visible, too controversial. Western media has spent years building a narrative about Chinese debt-trap diplomacy and neocolonialism. It's mostly nonsense. China's terms are generally much better than the IMF's, but the narrative exists. If we'd made China a signatory to this agreement, the Western media would have had a field day. Burkina Faso sells out to China. Chinese colonization of Africa continues. All of that. And more importantly, it would have given the West an easy excuse to oppose the agreement. They could frame it as countering Chinese influence rather than what it really is, countering Western control. Saudi Arabia and Pakistan are different. Saudi Arabia is a U.S. ally, complicated, increasingly strained, but still an ally. Pakistan has a long relationship with the United States. Both countries have their own complex relationships with the West. So when we build a framework with them, it's harder to dismiss as anti-Western or pro-China. It forces a more nuanced conversation. And here's the strategic part. China is still involved. Indirectly. They're financing some of the infrastructure projects that Saudi Arabia and Pakistan are committing to. They're providing technical expertise. They're opening their markets to our exports. But they're doing it quietly, behind the scenes, which is exactly what we need. Because the goal isn't to replace Western control with Chinese control. The goal is to build genuine sovereignty, where we have multiple partners, multiple options, and we're not dependent on any single power. That's the vision. And we're getting there. Now let me tell you about the military provisions of this agreement, because there's more to Clause 7 than just the prohibition on unauthorized operations. The agreement also establishes a joint training framework. Saudi Arabia is providing training for our Air Force. Pakistan is training our special operations units. And we're sharing our counterinsurgency experience with both of them. But here's what's revolutionary. The training happens on our soil, under our oversight, with our officers observing and participating in curriculum development. Compare that to Western military training. When the US or France trains African troops, they take them to their bases, their training centers. They control the curriculum. They control what gets taught, and often they use that training as an opportunity to recruit intelligence assets. We've had soldiers come back from US training programs and suddenly start asking questions about government policy, about my decisions, about why we're resisting Western pressure. And when we investigate, we find they've been approached by American intelligence. Subtly, carefully, but approached. That's how they operate. Training isn't just training, it's infiltration. But with this new framework, training happens here. Pakistani instructors come to Burkina Faso, Saudi military advisors work under our command structure, and we maintain full control over our troops. That's the difference between partnership and control. The agreement also includes provisions for military equipment sales. But again, with a crucial difference. Technology transfer requirements. When we buy equipment from Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, the agreement requires they provide us with maintenance training, spare parts, manufacturing capabilities, and technical documentation. Not just the equipment, the knowledge to sustain and eventually produce it ourselves. Compare that to Western arms sales. They sell you the gun, but not how to make bullets. They sell you the aircraft, but not how to maintain the engine. They create dependence by design. Because if you can't maintain your own equipment, you have to keep coming back to them. We're not doing that anymore. Every purchase comes with knowledge transfer. Every contract includes capacity building. Because the goal isn't just to buy equipment. It's to build an independent defense industrial base. Will that take years? Yes, decades probably, but we're starting, and that's what matters. Let me close with this. I know what's coming. I know the West isn't going to accept this quietly. I know they're planning their response. They'll try to divide us. They'll try to bribe Saudi Arabia and Pakistan into abandoning the agreement. They'll try to create crises that force us to choose between the agreement and other interests. And if all that fails, they'll come for me personally. I have no illusions about that. But here's what they don't understand. This agreement isn't about me. I'm just the person who had the opportunity to sign it. The framework, the vision, The model, it exists independently of me now. If they remove me tomorrow, the agreement continues. Other leaders will step forward, other countries will join, the movement will grow. Because what we've created here is bigger than any individual. It's a proof of concept, a demonstration that sovereignty is possible, that alternatives exist, that African countries don't have to accept permanent subordination. And once that's been proven, you can't unprove it. Once other countries see it's possible, they'll want it too. That's what terrifies NATO, not what we've done, but what we've shown is possible. And they're right to be terrified, because this is just the beginning. Every agreement like this makes the next one easier. Every country that joins makes the framework stronger. Every alternative we build makes Western control a little less absolute. This is how empires fall, not in one dramatic moment, but gradually, one agreement at a time, one partnership at a time, one choice at a time. We're watching the beginning of the end of Western hegemony, and they know it. My name is Ibrahim Traoré. I'm the president of Burkina Faso, and I just signed an agreement that terrifies the most powerful military alliance in history. Not because of what we're doing today, but because of what this enables tomorrow. And tomorrow is coming. Whether they're ready or not, remember that.